The Civil War was a bloody time in American history. It did end with the Union intact, but how did they manage to put the country back together and establish a place for freedmen in the country? It began with Republican Reconstruction. A few plans came before it, including Lincoln's 10% plan and the Wade-Davis bill, as well as Johnson's modified version of Lincoln's plan. But there was a fierce debate between radicals and moderate Republicans in the Senate. The radicals wanted to completely change the South and use federal power to do it, but moderates were opposed.
No. But it'll help keep us in power. No. We'll give blacks the vote. No.
What ended up taking place was the Reconstruction Act of 1867. The South was divided up into 5 military districts with strict curfews and such, and states that wanted readmission to the Union had to ratify the 14th Amendment, allowing slaves to become citizens.
During Reconstruction, the South was split up into 5 military districts, and they all had to ratify the 14th Amendment. Radicals wanted to keep the South out for a while because, they were being naughty and whatnot. Moderates wanted states' rights and to protect both citizens, and they wanted the black vote to keep Republicans in office. The military control of Reconstruction defied the Constitution. Reconstruction Act of 1867 was woefully inadequate because the Union left it to be held up by the military. Also,
one of the Republican ways of trying to get the newly freed slaves to rise up in society was the Freedmen's Bureau. Established in 1865, it was a way to aid former slaves by giving food and clothing to needy African Americans, and focused on education. However, it was not appreciated by white men of the South who resented the black population and preferred they stay in their ignorant states, so they would not steal jobs from poor whites. President Johnson, in fact, resented it so much that he repeatedly attempted to shut it down, vetoing it every chance he got.
The Freedmen's Bureau was an agency set up to help former slaves create a new life for themselves outside of slavery. It helped them get an education and helped them get new jobs. It's sort of similar to welfare that we have today. It lowered Johnson's popularity, and in the end it didn't really even work because they all became sharecroppers, which is basically the same thing as slavery. So, it kind of failed. And then Grant already got rid of it, so the end.
Another way Republicans attempted to aid the black society was with the Civil Rights Acts of 1866 and 1875. The one in 1866 gave blacks the privileges of American citizenship, striking at the Southerners who continued to discriminate against them and hold them down in society. The one in 1875 guaranteed equal accommodations in public places and prohibited racial discrimination on juries. However, Andrew Johnson continued to veto Civil Rights Acts, though Republicans continued to override him.
Civil rights.
The Civil Rights Acts gave African Americans rights to citizenship and went against black codes. Republicans went against the veto for both. Dred Scott. It was an attempt to shield against black codes. We were afraid Southerners will repeal it, so they went and made the 14th Amendment. Real racial equality would not happen for another 100 years.
In order to further cement the presence of blacks in American life, since the Civil Rights Act could be so easily repealed, Republicans passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The 13th, in 1865, freed all the slaves in the United States.
I'm free!
The 14th Amendment in 1868 fixed the provisions of the Civil Rights Bill in 1866 and granted full citizenship to all native-born or naturalized Americans, including former slaves and immigrants, repudiated deaths of Confederates, disqualified them from holding office, and penalized the state from keeping back eligible voters. The 15th in 1870 stated that no one could be denied the right to vote on account of race or color. It was to prevent states from amending their constitution to deny black suffrage.
Take that, white planter aristocracy.
Go away, Tom.
Well, the 13th Amendment of 1865, well, that's a long time ago, freed all those little slaves and abolished slavery, those poor African Americans. And the 14th Amendment, which was ratified in 1868, a really long time ago too. Gosh, people are old. Gave full citizenship to all native-born Americans, and that included all slaves and immigrants. They should not have gotten citizenship. And this is the first time that the states were required to uphold any rights for minorities. That excluded the whites because they were a majority. And it penalized any state from keeping any person that was eligible from voting. And my favorite, the 15th Amendment, no one could be denied the right to vote on account of race or color or slave, except it didn't give women the right to vote, which really sucked. But it paved the way for us. Blacks could vote. That was good. And it was a battle for liberty, and it created voting rights. Just to recap, if you didn't catch that all, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery from the South, and the 14th Amendment created citizenship for all blacks, and the 15th Amendment gave them the right to vote.
However, to combat the slaves' newfound freedom to vote, Southern states evoked the Black Codes. These were restrictions on the freedom of former slaves. This was to keep control over them to ensure a strong labor force, since they needed one to continue the cotton business as the war had left agricultural production at an all-time low. An example of this was the way in which they stopped blacks from voting. Literacy tests, poll taxes, and intimidation, like the KKK lynching blacks, were used to keep uneducated poor blacks away from voting booths.
This raised a problem, since there were many uneducated poor whites kept away from polls too. But this was solved with the grandfather clause.
No.
Bah.
Hey, it's all right here, youngster. This here boy is my grandson. He can vote, 'cause I sure well have voted in the past.
Okay. And it goes, Timothy.
The Black Codes were a series of restrictions on freedmen's rights, although they were technically free. These restrictions included the Jim Crow laws, literacy tests, poll taxes, and the grandfather clause. Along with these restrictions came the Ku Klux Klan, who tormented blacks because they wanted to go back to white supremacy. Because blacks were not financially stable after they became free, they had to resort to sharecropping. Sharecropping made freedmen's lives worse than before they became emancipated.
Many blacks had different methods pertaining to how they would deal with such discrimination. Booker T. Washington, for example, believed that blacks should work hard and gradually economically rise in order to earn the whites' respect. Whites encouraged and supported this plan, but many blacks, like W.E. Du Bois, resented having to earn whites' respect and wanted immediate equality. Washington gave a speech in Atlanta explaining his beliefs, which was dubbed the Atlanta Compromise.
The Atlanta Compromise was a speech, and Booker T. Washington, the guy who wrote it, focused mainly on better education for blacks and not segregation. And some of the results of it were that African Americans got better jobs, which I kind of need, and there was less violence between the blacks and the whites, which is, always fine and dandy.
Further discrimination came with Plessy versus Ferguson, a court case in which a black man sat in a white train car and was jailed, resulting in a verdict that set up a separate but equal doctrine for blacks and whites. It ruled that blacks and whites could have separate facilities as long as they were equal. Unfortunately, no one in the government really advocated that blacks' facilities had to be equal, so they were more often than not completely inferior.
Well, I guess kind of set up like a separate but equal type doctrine, I guess, something like that. But it wasn't really equal, but it was still separate, so I don't even know. And it totally, like, validated the South's segregational social order type thing, I guess, like, what they really want, what they were doing ended up getting validated in, like, a law and stuff, so that's pretty much what it was about. This country needs a new railroad. I can do it for you. Good. You know, that's a valuable market. I should probably invest in it. That sounds like a great idea. Yeah, it is. And if you're getting paid for it, I'm getting paid for it. So, we should hike up the prices. That's right.
The money would go straight into their own pockets, but this scheme was soon discovered, causing them to attempt to bribe other members of Congress with gifts of stock to stop the investigation. Of course, this was found out by the general public, too.
Credit Mobilier, a construction company owned by the larger stockholders of the Union Pacific Railroad. After the Union Pacific received the government's contract to build the Transcontinental Railroad, it hired the Credit Mobilier to do actual construction, charging the federal government nearly twice the actual cost of the project. When the scheme was discovered, the company tried to bribe Congress with gifts of stock to stop the investigation. This precipitated the biggest scandal in U.S. history and led to the greater public awareness of the government contraction. However, Grant did not personally profit from this. The dishonest to the men around him, it tarnished his presidency. It spread public awareness of further government corruptions.
Corruption was not only evident in the Grant administration, but in others after it. The election of 1874, for example, was having technical issues when the votes for 3 states had to be continually recounted. To solve this, Republicans and Democrats made a quiet deal behind closed doors.
Oh my god. Like, the Compromise of 1877 was this bargain thing that led to the election of that Hay guy. And, like, Hay, they had to remove the troops from the South. And, like, they didn't want to do that, but whatevs. And it was just, oh my goodness. It was the end of Reconstruction. And, like, the Republicans didn't want to do that, but, like, that's the price you pay. Like, oh my god. And the impact was kind of, like, gave the Democrats some power, and, like, they didn't like the Democrats. Like, the South was a Democrat. Like, ew.